Hello and welcome to Titanic Legacy, a creative collaboration between the Titanic Book Club and COVEpod, the Carganilla online variety entertainment podcast. This podcast explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with special guests who continue to produce creative work inspired by the Ship of Dreams. As you tune in at home today, doing chores, driving to work, at the gym, or out on your run or walk, however you're listening, thank you for giving us your time and welcoming us into your lives for the next half hour or so as we talk about Titanic and her long-lasting creative inspiration and impact. This is Titanic Legacy, the podcast. I'm your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I have the honor and pleasure of speaking with a direct descendant of one of Titanic's most famous and influential passengers. Before we bring her in, let me tell you a bit about her. Helen Benziger is the great-granddaughter of Margaret Tobin and James Joseph Brown, more widely known today, of course, as the Unsinkable Molly Brown and JJ. And Helen's father, G. Peter Benziger, was a New York newspaper publisher and the grandson of Molly Brown. And her mother, Edith, was an actress and model in Chicago. Hey, I like that. And like her great-grandmother, Helen does amazing charity work. She has worked in the past with helping train service dogs, raising funds for diabetes research and advocacy, fundraising for marching bands and local theaters. So much fun stuff to talk about here. Helen and her husband, David, live with their 18-month-old Doberman puppy, Fritz. And she has done so much in the Titanic community. She's served on the advisory board of Clive Palmer's Titanic project, the Blue Star Line, that we all, I think, remember. She's worked with the museum in Pigeon Forge and as an advisor for Titanic Honor and Glory project. And she's done a lot of fundraisers with the Last Night on Titanic dinners. And she actually played Molly in the Unsinkable Molly Brown musical. So much fun stuff to get to, so let's do it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Titanic Legacy podcast, Helen Benziger.
Hi. That's great.
Thank you so much.
That's amazing. Well, this is going to be great fun.
So I want to start with this. A lot of people, when they think of the Unsinkable Molly Brown, they think of Kathy Bates' portrayal in James Cameron's 97 film. If you are met on the street by somebody who wants any sort of introduction to who Molly Brown was, how do you describe her life and legacy to people?
Well, that's a 3-hour story.
In a nutshell. The best you can do in a nutshell.
Start with an easy one, Paul. Go ahead. First of all, she was, let's say that the movie The Unsinkable Molly Brown with Debbie Reynolds, which started as the Broadway play with Tammy Grimes, and also Kathy Bates, they capture her spirit. They capture her heart. And that is what people have come to know and love about her. But she was not like that. She was not a hillbilly. She didn't get up on a bar and dance. And by the way, that's how I found out she was my great-grandmother, as my mother had taken us to a movie, and we didn't know what it was. And we were sitting in the theater, and the lights went down, and everybody was quiet. There were no cell phones, so nobody had to turn them off. There were no marching popcorn bags across the screen. It was just this beautiful red velvet curtain that when the overture came up, the curtain came back, and it was an experience to go to the theater. It was great. But anyway, it was about a third of the way through the movie, and it's when Debbie Reynolds is in the bar. Christmas Morgan, I think was his name. She gave him. Anyway, she got up on the bar and was dancing and throwing her skirts up in wild abandon. And my mother reached across my sisters and I and said, "By the way, that's your great-grandmother."
Wow.
Followed by, "I just wanted to let you know from where your father's side of the family came." So it was It was quite an awakening. And I thought it was, some of my sisters were not really pleased with the image. I thought, oh gosh, I'm not adopted. Great. And, it was just a wonderful introduction to who my family never talked about her.
Mm.
You just didn't talk about the famous or infamous in the family. And people were more private back then. And I thought that somebody in my family ought to start talking about her to tell people what she was really like and to keep her legacy alive. So that's what I do.
That's a question I've got for later on, but we can address it now. I'm glad that you started to shine the light on it. And again, I mentioned this before we started recording, but thank you so much for making the time to do that for us today and to talk about her. Does it ever get monotonous or old or annoying if like people meet you and they find out that you're a direct descendant from her and they just want to talk about it? Does that ever get grinding at all?
It's a blessing.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a happy accident of birth. There's no reason why you weren't the great grandson or somebody else wasn't the great granddaughter. I do have 3 other sisters, but none of them feel inclined to do this. And I just felt a calling, and I followed it. But I don't think I answered your original question about who she was.
Well, it's kind of still in the vein of this conversation here, is spreading the word about who she was and the awareness and telling her story.
Well, she spoke 4 languages fluently. She played the piano like Van Cliburn. She acted on the French and the American stage. She ran for the U.S. Senate 8 years before women were given the right to vote.
I love that.
I mean, she invented the electric serving cart. I mean, this woman knew, there were no mountains that she didn't want to climb. If there was a hill there, she climbed it. She was a suffragette. During World War II, she took private ambulances paid for with private money across the Northern Pacific, almost the same route the Titanic took, and took them over to the French soldiers. And she also brought books in Braille because the weapon of choice back then was mustard gas and it would render them blind. So she decided she would help them learn Braille so maybe they could get a job or, not sit on the corner with a tin cup. She also brought actors and singers and, just entertainers. I like to refer to her as the Bob Hope of World War I because that's what she did. She would go over there and put on a show for the soldiers. And she was awarded posthumously, unfortunately, the French Legion of Honor, which is the highest civilian award they can give. It's like the Presidential Medal of Freedom here.
Yeah. That's amazing. She embodied I have my personal podcast. I talk to creators. It's not Titanic specific, but I talk to creators about what inspires them, about, how they continue to push their boundaries, spread their wings, try new things, and follow their heart's fire. And it sounds like she lived her life that way.
Oh, she did. She did. It's a wonderful quote. I wish I had memorized it. But it basically says that who knows when I walk outside if I'm going to be hit by a car or if I crash my car into a tree or if I go down in an airplane. But what a better way to go for someone who'd rather go out with a bang than with a fade out.
Mm.
And that's how she lived her life. I mean, when she was at the Breakers Hotel, that was the hotel she stayed at when she was down in Florida. There was a huge fire, which completely, Gulf, the breakers. She led 25 people outside to safety.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, she was amazing. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you the things she did. She supplied clothes and coats and socks and other, things that they needed to the Leadville orphanage every year till the day she died.
Wow. Such a big and giving heart, and we'll talk about all of.
She was a history preservationist. She saved the Eugene O'Neill House in Denver. She had a big part in putting up the monument in D.C. to the Titanic, the men who died.
And of course, the lighthouse in what?
And the lighthouse, which
yeah.
we're working on. Yeah.
Now, we're going a bit out of order, but that's totally fine. I love it, and we're gonna get to everything, I'm sure. But let's talk about that. Some listeners know I had the pleasure of visiting Washington D.C. last month, and the Washington D.C. Titanic Memorial for the first time. And I knew that she was involved with the committee, the influential women of the time that put that together.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned something I didn't know, that she helped pick the sculptor.
Oh, yeah. They were friends. Margaret had a little 43-room cottage in Newport and knew everybody there. And actually, they were the group, the Vanderbilts and all the influential people, Astors. She was friends with J.J. Astor. As a matter of fact, I go on rabbit trails. You're not going to be able to keep me in order. When she was in Egypt with my grandmother, Helen, after whom I'm named, and they were traveling with the Astors. And this was John Jacob and his new little bride, Madeline. She was 19. And they found out that Madeline was pregnant. So they had to book a ticket to go home. And the first available ship to go was Titanic.
Right.
And Margaret received a telegram that her first grandson, which was her son Larry's first child, in Kansas City, was ill, and she'd never seen the child. So Astor said, well, why don't you get on Titanic with us? We'll all go back together. And she said, great. So my grandmother was supposed to be on it, but she begged Margaret to let her stay in London for the spring parties. And she acquiesced to my grandmother, and otherwise I know I wouldn't be here. Because knowing my grandmother, she would have turned over and said, let me know how it turns out in the morning.
Well, and there is a story. I love that you just brought that up, because the fact that she wasn't even supposed to be on the ship in the first place, and then
No.
should have. I mean, she wanted to have her daughter with her as well, but her daughter stayed behind. And I've heard it's told that she would have been on board till the end if she had her way.
Yeah.
That she was trying to help people into the lifeboats and help other people as she does like the rest of her life, and help people have a better chance. And then she was basically put in the lifeboat against her will.
She was physically picked up under the arms by two officers and dumped in boat, in lifeboat number 6. And so they said, you're going too, lady. Otherwise, she would not have left the ship. Afterwards, she really took the women's movement to task. And she said, if you want the same rights as men, then you better start standing up like a man. And, she felt that with good cause, that the older women who had raised their children, such as herself, should have stayed behind to let the younger men get in the boat with their families. Because once those women and those children got to New York, they had nothing. The women who were first class, like my great-grandmother, of course, had a place to go. But these women had no money, no job, no one to go to. If they were lucky, they had family there. But Margaret organized, she made her rooms at the Ritz. She had a sort of an apartment at the Ritz where she stayed when she was in New York. And she made that her headquarters. And she made sure that everyone had, all the passengers had money in their pocket. They had a place to go. She arranged with, the Strausses, who owned Macy's, were probably, besides the Astors, the most famous couple on board. They were the ones that, if you recall, she wouldn't get in the boat, in the lifeboat. She stayed with her husband till the end. That story is a real tearjerker, really. But she really felt strongly that the men should have gotten in the boat with their young families. And I think that would have saved a lot of people a lot of suffering. And did you know that the White Star Line, the crew that went down with the ship, their families were charged their uniforms?
Didn't I hear that the White Star Line stopped their payment when the ship went down? They got paid for the time.
Exactly.
That's insane.
Yeah, but not the rest of the journey. Plus, they had to pay for their lost uniforms. And Margaret went to bat and changed it. So those families did get their pay, and they didn't have to pay for the uniforms because Margaret stepped in and took the White Star Line to task.
Wow, I didn't realize she had done that.
Yeah, she was also instrumental with a group of people that changed maritime law to have enough lifeboats on board for everybody. And it was you who, in your broadcast, in your podcast, that said something about the pose of that statue was very much like James Cameron's flying scenes.
I'm in Washington, D.C., and I was able to find the waterfront Washington, D.C. Titanic Memorial statue. And I've been doing a little bit of research, a little background and history on it, and I have a few questions, but I also might have a little hint or revelation as to James Cameron's motivation or inspiration for a really key part of the movie. I think when most people hear the phrase women and children first, they think of Titanic, the infamous order given by Captain Smith as the ship of dreams foundered in April of 1912. We think of those tragic stories, the men who stayed on board, husbands, fathers, separated from their wives and children in the name of chivalry and honor. In the days following the tragedy, some of the most influential women in the United States came together to organize and create a memorial in Washington, D.C., to honor those men who gave up their chances on the lifeboats for the women and children. The memorial would be designed by a woman, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and funded by the newly formed Women's Titanic Memorial Association. The marble statue depicted a man with arms outstretched in a pose meant to suggest the crucifixion, wearing only a sheet which appeared to be blowing in the wind. It was installed in its first location in 1930. The inscription on the base reads, "To the brave men who perished in the wreck of the Titanic, they gave their lives that women and children might be saved." When I had the opportunity to visit this memorial in its current location on the waterfront of Washington Channel in DC, my mind immediately went straight to James Cameron's 1997 film, the two iconic moments on the bow of the ship. Did this memorial inspire James Cameron in the making of the film? Think about this symbolism. The first instance on the bow happens as Titanic is going to sea, stretching her legs for the first time, and Jack and Fabrizio celebrate their journey on the bow. Jack famously shouts, "I'm the king of the world," a line improvised on set, but after the cheers and shouts of joy, celebrating their good fortune and barreling into the future, Jack settles into what we've come to know in pop culture as a flying pose. But was this actually James Cameron's symbolic interpretation of the DC Memorial's crucifixion pose? Later in the film, when Rose is finally ready to accept Jack as a romantic partner, in the moments before their first kiss, they pose together, mirroring the statue again. Cameron filled his movie with setups and payoffs. Jump to the end, the wood panel they find won't fit both of them. I'm not debating that, don't start with me. Jack makes the decision to sacrifice himself for Rose. When he does that, we come full circle to the apparent payoff of James Cameron's symbolism of Jack, initially taking the pose of the statue, a monument inspired by the sacrifices made by the men for the women on Titanic. To my knowledge, James has never confirmed or denied this link. Was this now iconic symbolism in the film actually inspired by the Washington, D.C. memorial? Seems like it obviously was. Mr. Cameron, if you're out there, hit me up. I really want to know.
And I never thought of that until I never occurred to me, but you're right.
If James Cameron wasn't such a Titaniac himself, like I wouldn't have considered it. But since I think, he's a brilliant man and he probably has, visited that memorial in Washington, D.C. before. And I think that he probably dropped that in as an Easter egg. Speaking of the film, there is that scene in which Molly Brown and Robert Hitchens are going at it in the lifeboat. As you mentioned, she was such an advocate for saving as many people as she could. And she's yelling, trying to get the women, those are your men out there, let's go back. And then there's the famous, shut that hole in your face scene. And it's really interesting because in one of my previous episodes, I got to talk to Simon Medhurst, who is the great-grandson.
Oh, I love Simon. Well, let me tell you what I think about that.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, yes, Margaret would have advocated to go back and pick up people because their lifeboat only had about 23 people in it, and it could hold 64. So that was a tragedy in itself. And I talked to Simon about this. And actually, I think I wrote the foreword for his book or the introduction or something, which I explain here. And in that, my opinion is that Hitchens was the officer put in charge of that boat. His obligation was to the passengers under his charge. He felt if he went back that they might be capsized by people trying to get in. They did argue, they did fight. It was not pretty, probably, because Margaret could be quite adamant. But I think Hitchens was doing what he was supposed to do in protecting and taking care of his charges.
You do say, I have it right here in front of me, the foreword of the book. Of course, Titanic Day by Day, 366 Days with the Titanic by Simon Medhurst. But the foreword by Helen Benziger says, many people that night had to make very hard decisions. I would ask that we all understand that none of us really know how we would have reacted in the same horrific situation. Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. And I feel that way about Bruce Ismay as well. You don't know how you'll react. Those men that stood on the side, there's an old saying that the last gentleman went down with Titanic. There is no more women and children first. And I agree with Margaret. I don't think there should be.
I love that you make this point because we had the pleasure of speaking with Cliff Ismay, who wrote the book Understanding J. Bruce Ismay.
Oh,
and
may I add, I love Cliff too. He's a doll. He's wonderful. Yeah.
We'll get all three of you on together. It'll be great.
Okay. Well, get George, get Cliff, get Simon.
And it clearly in his book, he makes it clear, like Bruce, he was doing all that he could to help people into the boats and help people get off the ship. And then this lifeboat is lowering in front of him and there's no one else around to get in or getting in. And he made the human choice of, there's room. I'm not pushing anybody out to get in. I'm going to go. And for the rest of his life.
And be in charge of the boat.
And
as he should have done.
Is the opinion of some people. But he was, villainized.
Yeah.
He's been villainized in history for doing that, which is a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. But, like I said, we never know what we do in those situations.
Are you involved in the Molly Brown Museum?
Oh, I used to go. Okay, I don't want to make this sound like it's well, anyway, I've got certain health issues that do not permit me to travel much anymore. I used to go out there a lot. Actually, I lived in a carriage house when I first went to Denver. And I'd never been to the house, so I thought, well, I'll just go and see what's going on. And I went through the tour. I didn't tell anybody who I was. I got into Margaret's bedroom, and I was standing against the wall, and there was a picture beside me. I didn't know it was there. And people kept looking at the picture and looking at me, and they'd look at the picture and look at me. And I turned around. Well, the tour guide knew who I was. I turned around, and it was just, I was 27 at the time, and the picture was Margaret in her first ball gown. And we looked a lot alike at the time, and still do, actually. There's a resemblance. But anyway, then the tour guide asked if I would mind, and I said no, that's okay. So anyway, that was my first introduction. Was Margaret's great-granddaughter was in her bedroom. First thing anybody knew.
Did you get any kind of feeling being there and feeling was the energy palpable?
Oh, yeah. The first time I touched the D door from Titanic, I got goosebumps. And that was the door that Margaret walked through when she boarded. That was a first-class boarding door. There have been a couple of incidents. Don't think I'm weird, but when I was there back in, I asked them if I could stay after closing and be in the house by myself. And the curator said, of course. And so everybody left, and I was there, and I was walking around the house and just absorbing everything. And I ended up in Grandpa Jim's bedroom. And I sat down in his rocking chair, and it was his. And all of a sudden, I just felt this presence. And I knew it was him. And I said, okay, Grandpa Jim, you're freaking me out. I'd like you to go now. I was really shook. And then all of a sudden, it was gone. I've been at a number of things at the house, and they do have mediums and people like that who come in. One of them, we were in Grandpa Jim's room again, and she was giving this, there's two little metal rods that come together. And I don't know what the circumstances are about them, but they're like divining rods, but they're metal. Mm-hmm. And they were passing them around, and I said, could I try it? And she said, oh, yes, I wish you would. So I took them, and I put them, and I said, Grandpa Jim, are you here? And they went together. I had nothing to do with it. And at one point, people were asking them questions, and of course, nobody said anything, but they just were wondering. Anyway, at one point, I said, okay, I've got to go now. And I tried to pull those metal rods apart, and they would not come apart.
Amazing.
I could not for the life of me. And my husband was there, and I was trying to pull them apart. And I finally said, okay, Grandpa Jim, we really have to go. And they came apart.
I just got full body chills like several times over those
I
two.
mean, I can't explain it. I really can't explain it. Sometimes people say they smell cigar smoke upstairs. And Margaret wouldn't let him smoke downstairs, so he smoked upstairs in his office.
Wow.
Or his bedroom. Yeah. And I don't know. One of the things I really loved about Margaret is she never forgot where she came, from where she came. She was born in Hannibal. She was a ditch digger's daughter. Her father, John Tobin, worked for the Hannibal Gas Works. And there were 6 children in the family because John and Johanna were both married before and came in together with 2 children each, and then they had 2 more. She worked in the tobacco barns.
Yeah. See, that's one thing that I think is really interesting. A lot of people, when they think of Molly Brown, they think of, oh, this millionaire philanthropist, but they don't realize she came such humble like beginnings. And when she married, like I think I remember a quote from her saying, like, she wanted to, raise her station through marriage, but then when she met JJ, she decided this was more important. This love for this man.
I'd rather marry a man I loved than,
And
then, she went out to Leadville absolutely intent on finding a rich husband.
Right.
And she married for love instead. I mean, Jim Brown started out as a day miner, and then because he was such a brilliant engineer, he was self-taught. He worked in the mines across the country, coming out to Leadville. He determined a way to shore up the walls of a certain mine that was the biggest gold strike to date in the history of the country. And he was given stock in the company and made a supervisor, and he rose in the company. And, it was just, I don't know, good old American plot,
Yeah, she followed her heart's fire and ended up, raising her station anyway.
Well, she did, isn't it? But she never forgot her best friend was her maid Mary. If the butcher came, I'll bring him upstairs, and she'd see him in her bedroom. Unheard of.
Yeah.
Unheard of. So she was breaking a lot of barriers back then. There's a story of one woman who said, really, Mrs. Brown, you shouldn't wear diamonds during the day. She said, oh, I thought so too, until I had them. So, if you got them, wear them. And, I believe the same thing.
If you got them, wear them. Anyway. I love that. Listen, we're up against the clock already because just having fun speaking with you is so much fun. Time flies like that. This is going to have to be part 1 of several conversations that we have, because you're such an amazing.
We can absolutely do that.
I have one more question for you before we say
right.
Till next
and I'll
time.
Try and stay on topic.
I've heard rumor of a possible autobiography that she started writing that might be somewhere in the world. Can you talk about that?
It's the Holy Grail. She was supposed to have written about it. My grandmother mentioned it, but no one knows where it is. I don't know if it exists anymore. Was it in the breakers when it burned down? Did she have it with her? Did she have it with her on Titanic? Who knows, where it is. So, it's kind of the Holy Grail that we're all hoping turns up someday. But,
one of the great beauties of the story of Titanic is we keep uncovering new things, and the story keeps continuing. We keep adding hints and clues, and that's why I wanted to start this podcast, and I'm so thankful for the book club's partnership with it, but just the constant storytelling and the constant way each plot turn, there's a plot turn every step of the way, it seems.
Oh, it is. Plot twist, 397, it just keeps going. And that's what keeps people glued to it.
The conversation continues, and it will continue. And I thank you so much for taking this time with us today. And I can't wait till the next time we can sit down together.
Oh, me too. Me too. Thanks, Paul. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. And before we wish everybody happy Titanic trails, I'd like to ask all our friends who enjoyed this conversation to subscribe to Titanic Book Club newsletter and the YouTube channel, of course. Links are in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you love conversations with inspirational creators, you can find many more on my personal podcast, COVEpod. COVEpod. Click over. Please give that a listen. I want to say thank you again one more time to our guest today, Helen Benziger. It was a true pleasure. And thank you all for tuning in. Until next episode, seize the day, follow your heart's fire, and make each day count.